What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're having a look at Magnus Carlsen's latest game in this week's Titled Tuesday tournament against Hikaru Nakamura, and these two could not be more evenly matched. I mean, Magnus literally at 32.66 ELO, Hikaru 1 point higher at 32.67. And how does Hikaru open in this game? He opens 1b3, the bent Larsen opening. I mean, very disrespectful. Hikaru, he pretty much only opens 1b3 as white in these Titled Tuesday tournaments. The audacity of this man, especially against the GOAT Magnus. All right, from here, Magnus goes e5, arguably the best move in response to b3. White goes bishop b2, pressuring the pawn on e5, and black defends knight c6. So far, very standard stuff. Now, there are a lot of lines from here. Normally, white does go, say, e3, knight f3, bishop b5, and so on, pressuring that knight. But instead, in this game, c4 was chosen, and now we have a transposition to some sort of, c4, e5 English opening with white going b3 and bishop b2. Not the most ambitious way to continue, and black going knight c6. Now from here, Magnus, g6 is the move. Very interesting, exposing his long diagonal, but fortunately, this pawn on e5 does block the diagonal completely, and there's no good way for white to capitalize on this. For example, f4 here doesn't work. There's simply no good way to deflect the pawn off the e5 square, so the rook on a8 will be okay for now. All right, from here, e3 is played. Black goes bishop g7. We have knight f3, then d6, then knight c3, knight f6, d4, and short castle. So black here going for literally a pure King's Indian defense setup as black, and white going for this weird pawn. It's not a triangle. Is it a, little Mayan pyramid with a plateau at the top, whatever you want to call it. It's a very solid setup for white. Doesn't really achieve a whole lot out of the opening, but Hikaru, he plays this a ton in these Titled Tuesday games. Sort of a weird version of a Kale opening. Very solid, but not very ambitious. All right, Hikaru, bishop b2 is the move, setting up short castles, perfectly fine. Black goes rook e8, setting up potentially e takes d4 or e4 ideas. Either way, the rook is certainly better placed on e8 than on f8. Now here, Hikaru, he is in no mood for a complicated middle game. With that in mind, he trades on e5, black trades back, and then the queens come flying off the board. We have queen takes and then rook takes. So here, already on move 10, the queens are off the board. Magnus does like these weird endgames early in the game, especially in blitz. Magnus, as we all know, a fantastic endgame player, and he's not a big fan of opening theory. So whenever he can get the queens off the board, he's usually very happy with that outcome. All right, now white goes a3, guarding b4, stopping knight b4 ideas from black, very solid, and black does go e4. Now, this is where the endgame actually gets interesting. This move e4 is very committal. It might not even be the best move, because here, white goes knight d2, and suddenly, white has a lot of pressure on this pawn on e4. Now, is this pawn a weakness, a strength, an asset, a liability? It all depends on how the game progresses. Obviously, black, if he can support the pawn on e4, that is going to be a huge asset, but at the same time, that pawn is very far advanced, and white is going to have a lot of different ways to attack it. So the entire game right now really does revolve around this pawn. Of course, it is being attacked. How does Magnus defend? In the game, bishop f5 was chosen, but this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead of that, the computer loves the idea of knight to e5. Now, the lines here are very, very complicated, but trust me, this is the right idea for black. Instead, bishop f5 chosen in the game. This is logical enough. I mean, that's probably the move I would play as black in this position. You defend the pawn on e4 with the bishop. The knight and the bishop do defend, but here Hikaru has some ideas. He goes h3, threatening g4. Obviously, if white gets in g4 here, that bishop on f5 must retreat, and then you are winning the pawn on the e4 square immediately, and that would be excellent for white. Now, instead here, Magnus h5, guarding g4. If white goes g4, then you take on g4, and then take with, say, the knight or the bishop, and you're doing excellent. Now, instead of that, Hikaru long castles the move. Very interesting. Of course, with the queens off the board, it is going to be quite difficult to attack the opponent, but here, you know, we still have a little bit of an imbalance with Hikaru castling on the queen side versus on the king side for white. Now here, h4 is the move for Magnus, clamping down on the king side, trying to stop any sort of g4 idea, but it turns out this is not a good move at all, as it actually does not stop the idea of g4. Here, white g4 comes anyway, a very strong move. Now, if this pawn was on h5, Black would just take on g4 and then take again with the bishop or the knight and be, you know, a little bit ahead in this game. Instead here, you can take en passant, but that is not nearly as effective. In the game, en passant was chosen, recapturing that pawn. And if you're a beginner, you don't know, whenever one side moves a pawn 2 squares forward next to the opponent's pawn, you can capture that pawn on the diagonal. So en passant chosen in the game. Then we have f takes g3. And then the move knight to e5, jumping in with the knight. Now here, white goes g4, driving back that bishop on f5. Where is it going to go? In the game, d7 is the chosen square. Now, again, white seemingly has the option of winning the pawn on the e4 square. However, there are some tactics on this long diagonal, and black would be just fine. So instead, g5 chosen, driving back that knight. And this is a very, very tricky move. You got to find the right square for the knight here. If you find the wrong square, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the right move for black right here in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, here, the key idea is going to be knight to h5. Now, I know the knight on the rim is often dim, but that is the only good square here, and you are eyeing the critical g3 square, which would fork the rook and the bishop, and overall, this does stop a lot of white's activity on this side of the board. Now, instead of that, knight to e8 was chosen in the game by Magnus, and this move is very problematic. Here, white just takes on e4 finally. Knight d takes e4, winning the pawn and opening up the d file for his rook. The rook is now very, very active. All right, Magnus, bishop f5, putting pressure on that knight. Of course, he only has one piece attacking it. The knight on f6, no longer on f6, it's on e8. Therefore, black having a lot of pressure on that knight on e4. All right, white goes h4, gaining space on the king side. Black goes c6. Then we have rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and then knight to f2, dropping back with that knight. Now we have knight c7, jumping up with that knight, knight c to e4, and then knight to e6. Now, this move right here turns out is a little bit dubious, and black is going to be in a little bit of trouble here as that knight, I mean, it can't go to d4, can't go to f4, can't go to g5, can't go to c5 right now. I mean, it's really not doing a whole lot. Instead of that, shockingly, the computer says you actually want to give up the bishop pair. Bishop takes e4, intending the move knight takes, then knight d3, and the knight forks the king and the bishop. That is the right idea. Now, instead of that, in the game, knight to e6 chosen by the goat, a little bit of an inaccuracy, and Hikaru starts to really press here. Rook d1, offering the trade of rooks and trying to challenge white's dominance of the open d file. Now we have rook takes d1, then king takes, and then bishop takes e4, giving up the bishop for the knight. Knight takes e4, and then knight d7. So here, Magnus, he is hunkering down. He has the two knights and the bishop versus the knight and the bishop pair of white. Of course, white is also up a single pawn, essentially the pawn on the e-file. And here, Magnus, he has to just hunker down and do the best he can to defend. He even only has 6 seconds left on the clock versus the 1 minute and 15 seconds of Hikaru. Hikaru really pulling away with this game. All right, Hikaru, he decides to simplify here. Bishop takes g7, chosen, trading those bishops. We have king takes and then knight d6, jumping in with the knight and threatening the pawn on the b7 square. Now we have knight d8, the knight jumps back and defends. Bishop g4 pressures that knight on the d7 square, and now we have knight to e5 jumping up with that knight. Now bishop c8 again pressures b7, b6 tries to defend, and then king to e2 and king to f8. Both sides trying to get their kings to the center of the board. Of course, with f6 guarded by that pawn, the black king has to go back in order to go forward. All right, bishop h3 is the move, then a6, then a4, and then c5. Now we have knight c8 again, ganging up on that pawn on b6. Magnus down to 1 second left on the clock. This is not looking good for the GOAT. If you're a Magnus fan, I mean, don't hold your breath. It's not looking good. All right, knight d6. The knight jumps up. Then we have knight takes b6, king to e7, bishop to c8, and then a5, clamping down on the queen side here. Now, bishop b7 pressures that knight on c6, knight to b4, bishop e4, king d6, knight c8 hits the king, king d7 hits the knight, knight to a7, threatening to jump to b5, for example. King to e7, and then sure enough, knight to b5 is the move. Now we have f6, breaking up the pawns on the king side. G takes f6, king takes f6, then knight to c7. Now we have knight to f7, drops back with the knight, knight to a8, knight d6, bishop b1, knight c6, and knight b6. Both sides struggling to make progress here. Of course, Hikaru, he is up 2 pawns here. The pawns on the b file and the e file, and his 1 extra bishop is worth more than the 1 extra knight in this kind of relatively open position with pawns on both sides of the board. It's really just a matter of time for Hikaru to find the right way to break through. But of course, the GOAT, he defends on. Now we have knight e5, knight d5 hits the king with check, king to e6, knight f4 again hits the king, king to f6, king to f2, knight to c8, the knight drops back, knight d3, offering the knight trade. And here, Magnus, he actually goes for it. Knight takes d3, bishop takes, knight d6, and here finally, king to g3. And in this position, Magnus, he does not resign. As you can see by the red timer bar, he actually runs out of time on the clock. Magnus was down to roughly 1 second left. Hikaru having 14 seconds left. And here, Magnus, he runs out of time before he can defend in this very complicated endgame. So, wow, very impressive performance by Hikaru in this crazy blitz game. I mean, Hikaru is showing why he is rated 1 ELO point higher than Magnus on chess.com. Very funny how that works out. These two literally could not be more evenly matched. The only way they would be if they were both rated exactly the same. So, very impressive stuff by these two chess titans. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game. And if you want to see more action of Magnus and Hikaru and so on, check out any of the videos showing up on your screen right now. I've got a playlist of Magnus and, more videos being recommended to you by YouTube itself. So check one of those videos out, and I'll see you in the next video.